Let's dive right into this explainer. When we picture an Indian village, it is so incredibly easy to fall back on those romanticized stereotypes, right? Bullock carts, peaceful, idyllic green fields. But today, we're basically tossing those outdated assumptions right out the window. We are going to unpack the massive, complex, and rapidly transforming reality of the Indian rural community. We'll be looking at the true characteristics, the deep-rooted structural challenges, and the sweeping transformations that are happening as we speak. So here is our game plan for today. 1. Defining rural India. 2. Core village characteristics. 3. Major rural problems. 4. Efforts for rural development. And 5. Constitutional protections. Let's get right to it. Section 1. Defining rural India, the baseline. To really grasp the sheer magnitude of what we're discussing, just think about this staggering number, 68.84%. According to the 2011 census, nearly 69% of the entire Indian population lives in rural areas. That's spread across roughly 640,000 villages. So India isn't just a country that happens to have villages. It is, fundamentally and historically, a land of villages. But how do we actually define one? It's fascinating to look at how different sources define this. On one hand, you have sociologist A.W. Green, who highlights a social we feeling. He describes it as a cluster of people sharing a common way of life in a narrow territorial radius. But then, if you look at the Encyclopedia Britannica, they give a purely economic and geographic definition, focusing on a low population density and an economy driven by producing food. And honestly, it's the combination of those two elements, the tight-knit social bonds and the land-based economy, that truly defines the traditional Indian village. Section 2. Core village characteristics. Unsurprisingly, the absolute dominant feature here is agriculture. But it's super vital to understand that in this context, agriculture is not just a 9-to-5 job. It's an entire way of life. Agriculture drives roughly 40% of the national income, yet it has to carry the weight of supporting over 60% of the people. From pottery to carpentry to blacksmithing, almost all of your traditional village crafts and livelihoods are directly tied to and completely dependent on this agrarian base. And because these villages are geographically pretty small, literally everyone knows everyone. This creates highly informal primary relationships and a really powerful social homogeneity. People share similar behaviors, similar dress, similar mindsets. It acts like a massive social glue, fostering mutual cooperation, which is absolutely crucial during times of crisis. At the very center of this tight-knit community is a deep faith in religion and rituals, often revolving around the Gram Devata, or village deity, which anchors their annual festivals and their shared identity. This brings us to a really fascinating sociological concept called familialism. As sociologists Sorokin and Zimmerman pointed out, in these agrarian settings, you can pretty much forget about the I. It is all about the we. The family, rather than the individual person, is the absolute baseline for all decision-making and social norms. Collective thinking overrides individual interests entirely. So, how in the world is a tightly knit community like this actually governed? Administratively, it relies on the Panchayati Raj. You can think of it like a 3-tiered democratic cake, built from the grassroots level upward to promote rural reconstruction. You've got the Gram Panchayat down at the village level, the Panchayat Samiti at the block level, and the Zilla Parishad at the district level. Section 3. Major rural problems. Which naturally brings us to a pretty heavy question. Is the traditional village actually surviving the test of time? The hard truth here is that the idyllic, peaceful image of village solidarity we just looked at often masks some severe underlying crises. And these crises are challenging the very survival of these traditional communities today. The realities on the ground are stark, to say the least. A vast majority of these populations live under the grim shadow of poverty, particularly your small and marginal farmers. Illiteracy remains rampant, despite all the government efforts. And even more tragic is the severe agrarian distress and crippling debt that has led to heartbreaking waves of farmer suicides. On top of all that, family disputes often chop land up into plots so incredibly tiny, they become essentially impossible to farm profitably. And we really must look squarely at the entrenched social inequalities too, because contrasting that idealized we feeling is a reality heavily influenced by strict traditional norms. Patriarchy dominates, often assigning a subordinate status to women and feeding into discriminatory gender stereotyping. Then you have the massive influence of the caste system, a rigid hierarchy linked to notions of purity and pollution. This dictates economic dependencies, historically seen in systems like balyudari, which was a traditional barter system tying village artisans permanently to upper-caste landowners. Imagine a massive piece of modern machinery rolling into a very traditional rural field. It sounds like progress, right? But the reality is that introducing modern tools into conservative societies often faces fierce resistance. A heavy reliance on traditional mindsets, combined with a perfectly understandable fear of the unknown, can sometimes encourage a fatalistic attitude among the rural poor, and that can significantly slow down the pace of necessary development. Section 4. Efforts for Rural Development. So, how are things changing? Indian sociologist A.R. Desai identified 4 major trends driving rural transformation. First, there's the rapid shift from a subsistence economy to a market economy. Second, the introduction of modern technology. Third, the abolition of intermediaries like the zamindari system, which helped break up those historically exploitative landlord monopolies. And fourth, the emergence of new institutions that link these rural areas directly to larger urban and national organizations. If we look back at the government's timeline, you can clearly see how interventions have evolved. It all started back in 1952 with a community development program, which was meant for general, all-around village development. That evolved in 1957 into empowering villages administratively through the Panchayati Raj. Later, in 1979, the Integrated Rural Development Program replaced those early initiatives, bringing a far more targeted approach to rural upliftment. Fast forward to today, and those early efforts have exploded into highly targeted, massive schemes. We have the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana building out vital road infrastructure, MGNREGS practically guaranteeing rural employment, and the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan fighting that rampant illiteracy we discussed earlier. The government is basically throwing resources at the rural crisis from every possible angle, including housing and livelihood missions, just trying to stabilize these communities. Section 5. Constitutional Protections. And working alongside those development programs, the Indian Constitution actually mandates positive discrimination to help dismantle those traditional inequalities we talked about. Article 14 guarantees equal rights, while Articles 15, 16, and 46 specifically empower the state to create job reservations and educational promotion. This is directly aimed at protecting backward classes and scheduled castes and tribes from exploitation. Furthermore, Articles 330 and 332 ensure their political voice by reserving seats in legislative assemblies. So, what does this all mean for the future? Ultimately, technology, economic reform, government schemes, and better roads are creating what sociologists call a rural-urban continuum. As the historical lines between the city and the village begin to blur, that old social homogeneity is being replaced by heterogeneity. It's creating a deep structural interdependence between rural producers and urban consumers. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Our bustling urban centers depend entirely on rural agricultural production to survive. The village is the absolute backbone of the nation. So, as traditional boundaries fade and these rural communities navigate the turbulent waters of modernization and severe economic distress, how will the resolution of these rural crises shape the economic and social future of our society as a whole? The fate of the village, it turns out, really is the fate of the nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.